When I first started the T2T series, the concept was pretty simple. I would bring HSR characters into Genshin Impact and adjust their kits to fit the world of Teyvat. The foundation was already laid out for me, so all I had to do was flesh out the finer details. I played around with a very strict rule that I would take a kit and present it in a way that was nearly identical to the original. A few interesting ideas came about, such as adding some new foundational mechanics to the game, but I started running into a few issues as the episodes went on, issues that started to make me worry about the longevity of this series. So this video is kind of an interlude episode. I'm revamping some core mechanics I implemented a while back, and I'm going to be establishing a completely new direction for the future of Trailblazer 2 Traveler. As always, my description has disclaimers, timestamps, social media links, music credits, and a link to my Discord server. Fasten your seatbelts, everyone. Let's get started. The initial goal with the series was a simple one-to-one translation between HSR into Genshin. This meant having little to no changes in their mechanics, and this resulted in two things, both of which had their own set of problems. The first result was that certain kits would be translated into Genshin, but in keeping their intended mechanics, they introduced completely new foundations to the game, which changed how we view the combat system as a whole. Episode 3's Kafka episode was the start of this. By keeping her design around dot mechanics, I created a whole new damage layering system, where certain abilities could have an additional follow-up or dot typing, in addition to elemental and ability typings. Silverwolf founded a new debuffing system, and Harmony Trailblazer started a super reaction system. I found this to be a very fun idea, since new concepts and expansions always make my brain chemistry go yippee! But I started to notice a couple comments voicing this one concern. It doesn't feel like Genshin. And that statement is true. Genshin and HSR are vastly different games with vastly different combat engines. Not every character is capable of being just slammed into the world. So to make it work out, you either change the rules of the character or change the rules of the world. For me, I made the decision to change the world, because there was more of this ripple effect that allowed us to view canon Genshin units in new ways. Now the second result in my strict kit design rule was completely the opposite of the first result. While characters with HSR specific kits created fresh foundations for Genshin, units who had more standardized kits were more difficult to make interesting. Some of our kit designs, especially in the early game, don't have unique mechanics. Take our set of healers. Bailu, Locha, Lynx, Natasha. All of them have different ways they heal, yes, but at the end of the day, all they do is heal. And is that really a kit I want to make a whole video on? Even if I was covering a new mechanic, such as follow-ups, dodge, super break, trying to make another video cover that same mechanic would eventually feel a little repetitive. There was this double-side problem that was beginning to build, cause I was trying to say that the game should still feel like Genshin, but the HSR characters should also feel like their HSR counterparts. If I rework them to fit Genshin or to feel more unique, they no longer feel like the same HSR units. And when I kept their HSR mechanics the same, it starts to not feel like Genshin. I started off with a strict set of limitations, and over time, I started loosening up the restrictions. Now, I'm really letting go of the reins. Moving forward, I'm going to let myself have a lot more creative freedom over a character kit design. And I mean a lot of freedom. Whatever idea I might have, I want to feel like I could implement it. I'll share some rough ideas I've been cooking up. All of these are, of course, subject to change. We have general reaction-based units. Ranmei has unique interactions with Bloom, in which she'll use the reaction to enable a different part of her kit. We have faction-oriented mechanics. Natasha, Luca, and Zila are all planned to be grouped to have a special interaction with a new burning rework I call the Wildfire reaction. Or the IPC members have a shared mechanic involving their cornerstones. We also have other mechanics tied to lore. Jingliu, Blade, Hanya, and Shuiyi are planned to have a mechanic known as Mara Struck. And then there's units like Trailblazer, Danheng, March 7th, and Tingyun, who have different units who are the same character but with different forms. That gave me the idea of creating certain character mechanics that stay consistent among each of their forms. With all of this being said, T2T is going to start becoming my personal sandbox series. The other 3 concept series I have are strictly Genshin oriented, so I still want to follow certain gameplay rules to keep it realistic. But T2T has already undergone foundational changes to the world, to the point where I can just embrace the chaos and say fuck the laws of Tevat. This entire section was covered to set your expectations properly as I move forward with this series. And here is my explicit message saying that this is how it's going to change. This whole concept should have some sense of familiarity to Genshin and HSR, but it is not going to be the same game at all. The mechanics are all different, the characters are going to be different. I'm basically making a whole new game, which is weird and exciting all the same. It's like a Genshin and Honkai Star Rail love child. We can call it something like, Honkai Impact. Yeah, that works. Anyway, with establishing this new direction, I wanted to take this time to establish some of the other mechanics that are getting reworked, starting with follow-up, dot, and now Memosprites. When I first started the series, I implemented a mechanic that I'd like to call the layered damage typing. HSR functions differently from Genshin in terms of labeling its damage, because in HSR, something like burst and follow-up damage could never coexist. But since nearly everything in Genshin revolves around these damage types, we have to maintain those systems to ensure certain teams and builds don't get negatively affected. For example, switching Xingqiu to deal follow-up damage with his burst means he would no longer synergize with burst damage bonuses. To prevent this, all HSR-related damage typings are layered on top of the original typings. Xingqiu is now a unit who can benefit from Hydro, Burst, and follow-up damage bonuses. It still works with his original builds, but now has additional benefits with our new system. I differentiated follow-ups as abilities that require a trigger condition, such as Xingqiu's burst with normal attacks or Nahida's skill with triggering a reaction. Meanwhile, dot abilities would be anything that was able to deal damage on its own. This meant Charlotte's skill, Yai's skill, Farina's skill, etc. All of them would be able to utilize dot bonuses. There was an original concern about the whole idea that follow-ups had to be summons and dots had to be marks. And that didn't matter to me. Genshin isn't a game system that uses these two types in the first place, so there's no reason to be so strict with it. It's much better to focus on the mechanic itself, not the form it takes. However, there was still a scenario that was hard to figure out. Dot damage is a typing that's reliant on the action bar. Follow-ups generally just have a trigger condition, but there's a summon form of follow-up damage where the summon deals damage at an interval rate based on the action bar. This type of mechanic is like a mishmash of follow-up and dot. In Genshin, the same characters would be units like Yai or Farina, and I originally considered them to be dot, but people could make the same argument that it would be follow-ups. I never had a solid way to address this, that is, until the release of Memosprites. When it comes to implementing Memosprites into Genshin, I'm not going to bring in the entire mechanic where summons can take damage, get targeted, or how you have to level them up separately from talents. That's not getting added. Instead, I'm bringing Memosprites as a mechanic to expand on the layered damage system. In an attempt to separate this series a bit from the HSR system, I'm going to be relabeling the damage typings as a whole. That way, I can develop this from my design perspective without the pressure of matching HSR system. The first damage layer is follow-up, which we're renaming to coordinated damage. Coordinated attacks are already a labeled thing in Genshin, so I figured matching the damage label to this would be the best choice. This form of damage requires the ability to activate via a specific condition. Character abilities may include things like Xingqiu's Burst, Nahida's Skill, Albedo's Skill, or Auroron's A1. The second type is renaming Dot to Automatic or Automated Damage. When these abilities are active, they are constantly active, they'll deal damage at set intervals, and would function the exact same way with or without an enemy nearby. These units include Xiangling's Burst, Kazuha's Burst, or Auroron's Burst. The third type is turning Memosprites or summons into turret damage. Turret damage is a bit of a combination of the previous two types, kind of like how summons are a combination with follow-up and dot. They'll deal damage at set intervals, kind of like automated damage, but there is one condition that requires it to work, kind of like coordinated damage. This condition is that the ability will activate or deactivate when an enemy is nearby, and this specific mechanic is what separates automatic damage from turret damage, especially when both abilities are a summoned ability. So, an automated ability like Kazuha's Burst still requires an enemy to be in range to deal damage, but the ability itself ticks at the same 2-second interval. Xiangling's Burst follows a set circular path, and it does have a cooldown in which it deals damage, but an enemy being or not being nearby doesn't cause her Pyronado to suddenly stop moving or anything like that. Then, when you look at turrets like Farina or Yai, these abilities specifically stop their activation with no enemy presence. This was the original list of every possible ability that fell into the follow-up versus dot category. As you can see, super uneven, super unbalanced. This is the new list with the reworked system. There are still some abilities that could be up for debate, such as Emily's A1 being a follow-up versus a turret, but the main idea is that the damage layering is more even. I don't expect this mechanic to be a massive change to Genshin units, but when I add more HSR units that have synergies with follow-up, dot, and Memosprite/summons, we'll at least have a solid list to refer to for Genshin character synergies. Now, with this being said, Kafka, who covered dot/automatic damage, is getting an inherent nerf. Now, she doesn't synergize with a large portion of the characters due to those units getting shifted into the turret category, which sucks, and maybe in the future I'll rework her in a future video. But for now, I do want to focus on making characters I haven't already covered. Anyway, TLDR, the introduction of Memosprites fixes a few core issues of follow-up versus dot abilities in Genshin. We've also renamed everything so that it can separate itself a bit more from HSR's mechanics. That'll be it for this section, and the next one is going to be a change to our reaction system. In episode 5 of T2T, I introduced Harmony Trailblazer, who was supposed to be this unit who enabled a special mechanic called super reactions. These reactions had two unique traits. One, elemental damage bonuses now contribute to the damage dealt by a reaction. 2. Transformative reactions would contain special property changes to make reactions feel different. Harmony Trailblazer unlocked every single super reaction with their kit, but by creating this system, I inherently locked myself out of creating multiple variants of the same reaction. For example, Fugue is planned to be a unit who enables Super Overload, but once I make her video, I tie that back to Harmony Trailblazer, who would also enable Super Overload, which means I can't have a second character with a different form of Overload reworking. And then, Lunar Reactions came into the mix, which was basically my whole idea for Super Reactions, but with the addition of new damage formulas, EM pooling, and direct reaction damage. My original idea with super reactions is going to be somewhat the same, but it felt like a good time to tweak the system and iron out the kinks. Starting off, the way we approach special reactions will be a lot more flexible. I am reworking the super reaction system to be generalized. Super reactions are now an umbrella term for any special reaction. This means lunar reactions, Nilou blooms, and other unique reactions I implement in the series would be a super reaction. Multiple iterations of the same reaction can now exist in T2T, which means more possibilities for reaction ideas. I mentioned earlier how the Wildfire faction enables a special burning variant called Wildfire, or how Fugue will utilize a special Overload variant. With this new reaction system, we could have a second character who enables a different version of Burning or Overload or literally anything else. I'm also implementing a new system mechanic called Break Formulas. It's going to work very similarly to Lunar Charge and how it allows for EM pooling. But instead of using crit, it follows my original idea where it uses elemental damage bonuses. For transformative reactions, damage for all units involved is added together, with the highest contributor dealing the full amount of damage, the second highest dealing half, and every other unit dealing 1/12 of their damage. Certain reactions like Bloom, where the elemental trigger actually changes the aura, will have a separate variant, which I'll cover in a future video. It's also pretty out there, but I did want to try creating a system for quicken and amplifying reactions. One where the trigger element does still matter, but also something to allow the aura character to contribute their EM in some capacity. I'm still finalizing this idea, but my current iteration is adding a break formula called Amplified Quicken and Catalyzed Melt/Vaporize. Amplified Quicken would pool everyone's EM, put it through an extra balancing formula, and then create a multiplicative bonus for all aggravate and spread damage. Catalyzed Melt/Vape would use the aura unit's EM for a base damage bonus, while the trigger unit uses their EM for the multiplicative bonus. This idea was mainly to allow aura units to contribute to Melt and Vaporize. Meanwhile, Quicken already doesn't have issues with aura ownership, but every other reaction is getting some kind of damage buff, so I added a Quicken version for the sake of equality. Here's another important thing. Super reactions and break formulas are going to be separate mechanics, which means they can exist independently. For example, the Wildfire reaction I mentioned earlier is a super reaction, but it doesn't follow break formulas. Ron May's iteration for a Bloom buffer involves her enabling break formulas for all Bloom reactions, but she doesn't rework Bloom into some sort of super reaction, and Fugue would be intended as a unit who reworks Overload into a super reaction, but also enables their break formulas. I also want to play around with this other mechanic called Direct Reaction Damage, which was inspired by the Direct Lunar Charge. This isn't too hard to implement actually, because instead of using this 1446.9 value as the base damage, we just replace that with a stat scaling multiplier. This is also separate from super reactions and break formulas, which means I can play around with direct reaction damage for regular transformative reactions. How does all of this affect Harmony MC? In short, they're getting a small nerf. Originally, they enabled super reactions, which was the combination of damage changes and property changes. Now that we've separated the two, Harmony MC is only going to be a unit who enables all break formulas. In other words, all reactions get buffs to their damage and EM pooling, but would function exactly as they would in any other team. If that's still kind of OP for you, we could also say that Dendro reactions are the only ones to get break formula buffs, which is still really strong for Quicken, Burning, Bloom, and I do plan to add that Rhymegrass reaction, so that too. TLDR, the reaction and super reaction system was reworked to fit the new lunar reactions, and now allows me to create different combinations and variants for any reaction idea I might have in the future. That's all for this section. This last section is just the smaller changes that couldn't stand as its own section. Starting off, True Damage. It's a mechanic added to HSR which is basically a multiplicative bonus. If a character does 1000 damage and another instance of 25% true damage is inflicted, then you just add an additional 250 on top of that. No bonuses or damage mitigation affects this value. It's definitely easy to implement this, but in Genshin, it's just a glorified amplified reaction. if you vaporize with the flat 1.5 multiplier, it's the same thing as a non-vaporized hit with a 50% true damage scaling. So I'm not really looking to add an exact iteration of true damage with this series, but I might consider variations of this mechanic, all of which are close to true damage, but could not be reasonably labeled as true damage. Another smaller change I'm making for the series is that I'm going to follow a similar formula to the character creator vids, where I don't include damage multipliers with their kit descriptions. I'm now going in this new direction of creating new ideas, and as such, I want to focus kit balancing around the mechanics instead of around damage calcs. Finally, you might start to see more weapons or artifacts that utilize these original mechanics. I mentioned before the Marastruck mechanic for some of our Xianzhou characters, and I do want to make an artifact set that would be their best in slot, or characters like Kafka, Black Swan, and now Hycillans being characters with the dot or automatic damage. We might see future artifacts that would give them a new best in slot. Anyway, that's gonna do it for this video. My concept brain train has been going into overdrive with all these what if ideas, and I really just needed a place to put them all in. I suppose I could have made a completely new series which served as my sandbox for ideas, but T2T had quite a few issues that were threatening the longevity of the series. Episodes would start becoming repetitive and stale, and this was also affecting my personal interest in the series. But it's not like I wanted to just drop this whole series entirely. Bringing in other characters from a different game into Genshin is still a really cool idea that I want to continue doing, so I instead chose to rework Trailblazer the Traveler. That way, I have the sandbox series I want, and I can still mess around with the original idea of sliding HSR mechanics and characters into the world of Genshin. Also, as a side note, the lore-related mechanics I plan to add do require me to understand the lore of HSR to at least a higher level of expertise. So, if any of you guys love watching my streams, I am planning to play and stream HSR story content on my channel. That way, I can start implementing more world building and lore ideas into T2T. I haven't played since 1.3, and I stopped watching other playthroughs around 2.5, so I have a lot of catching up to do with the latter half of Penacony and all of Amphorius. Now, back to T2T, Genshin and HSR are constantly changing and evolving, so this may not be the last time I make an update video or rework some T2T mechanics. This new direction with the series has really ramped up my creative juices, and I'm super excited to dive into all these new ideas. If you enjoyed, consider leaving a like and subscribing to support my channel. Let me know in the comments which characters you're excited to see, and if there's any new game mechanics you suggest I try exploring with this new direction of the series. Thank you all again for watching, and I will see you in T2T version 2. Bye!